Be curious, be humble, and work hard.
That's Tom Brady. That's the most basic of the advice given today as C.J. Stroud, Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson, and Will Levis were at some like kind of little summit out in L.A., and they met with Travis Scott, the Houston-based rapper, Houston-born rapper, Tom Brady, who's Tom Brady, and Michael Rubin, who I had no idea who this was, who's dispensing advice out to my quarterback and these three other slubs. It's Michael Rubin, who was at his house. He's the CEO of Fanatics, and the first thought I had was, isn't Fanatics the company that shut down that really fun celebration they were doing with the big hats in Atlanta because it wasn't their gear? And no, that was New Era. They do the hats. Fanatics does the sports memorabilia, world's leading provider of licensed sports merchandise. So for those of you in my core audience who don't know who Travis Scott is, big time rapper, but from Houston. And because of that, I feel like CJ Stroud won this little summit. Basically, it's these other three guys were there as afterthoughts. Travis Scott will give his full force of attention to CJ Stroud, obviously. So here is Tom Brady.
When something goes wrong with Trav or with Mike with his company, right? With me, like the only thing you do is work harder, man. Mm-hmm. The only thing you do is work harder. Like defeats can't make you work less hard. I think that's the point. Like when shit hits the fan, you gotta change the energy. You gotta put more into it, never less into it.
So work harder. Like that sounds like basic advice. The thing that did it for me there, especially when it comes to somebody like Tom Brady, is he said change the energy. And unfortunately, it did remind me of the book that Deshaun Watson had recommended once upon a time, which was The Coffee Bean. And I went out and I bought The Coffee Bean, and it was actually a good. It's really a hardcover pamphlet. It's not much of a book, but the main theme and the main purpose of that book, which I enjoyed, was be the person who changes the energy. Like the coffee bean changes its environment. It's the coffee bean gets dropped into water and transforms the environment into something else. And obviously, if you talk about changing the energy, I think that's the hardest part of leadership sometimes, is being the person that when everybody feels one way and it's easy to give in, or it's easy to relax, or it's easy to quit, like to be the person that's changing the energy. And it's not always so simple. You know, it takes more than just a verbal whiplash or a verbal lashing of people. Advice number 2. This is from Michael Rubin himself, a man who I just learned of, but now I will hang on his every word.
Every day we're screwing things up. We just got to get a lot more right than we get wrong and keep learning from it. No matter how deep something is, I wouldn't say I get stressed out about it. I'd say I'm more like I use that craziness to like be more focused. You've seen this in me. The tougher shit gets, the more focused I am.
That part, I think that I actually had to think about Michael Rubin's part for a little bit, because I think sometimes people that have that skill don't understand or realize how great a skill it is. I think my natural tendency is to get frazzled as hell when things get hard, and then I have to like slap myself, like in the old time movies when a man would slap somebody and tell them to get a hold of themselves. So I think with what Michael Rubin is talking about, simplifying is what works for me. Just simplifying, just paring down all of those things that you need to focus on. So he's talking about focusing. What I would tell younger guys, and what I tell rookies all the time, is you've got to simplify. And one of the purposes of this meeting was they were talking about handling, marketing and branding and all those other things that come along with being a star quarterback, and how to handle all that. So paring down the things that you actually do focus on, because you've only got so much focus to go around. And then I would add on to that while still maintaining the ties with your family that you need to. That's the really hard part. So pare down, get rid of all the extraneous people. Next bit is Travis Scott himself.
Surrounding yourself with a core team and have somebody that's next to you, making sure that you're being the best person that you can be in your main field.
The part that I was interested in that he said just there was keeping the main thing. And when you keep the main thing, this is advice that I've heard given to athletes going back to, I read an article about Tiger Woods, like when he was 22, 23, 24 years old, when he was living at Isleworth there in Orlando, and Shaq had a place there. I think Michael Jordan had a place there. All these athletes were kind of took Tiger under their wing and gave him advice. And I remember that one being like the main thrust of it was keep the main thing. Never lose sight of the fact that first and foremost, you got to take care of football, and everything else falls into place, and you can organize it. And that's harder to do than it might seem when these guys are bombarded with so many things. The thing that I like about CJ, and we've played that interview before where he talks about at one point in the NIL process, it was in that interview on the pivot. He told his advisors, listen, I don't want to do any more NIL. I got to back off on this a little bit and basically keep the main thing. So I like that part. I interrupted you, Travis Scott. I apologize. I'll let you finish.
Who can make sure that you're up every day, going to the gym, got your bag. That's the key person to make sure that you're maintained every day-to-day life is like straight.
I like Travis Scott's advice a lot. One thing Sean Pendergast and I talked about, yes, have somebody that keeps you honest. Have an accountability partner. That's what I like. Like it's the same as a workout partner or somebody in life. I've recommended before, I feel like single grown men should have like an adult nanny, like a nanny for adult men that actually does things almost like a platonic spouse that does all the things that a spouse might do for you, except it's somebody that you would never, ever, ever touch or screw up the relationship with sex. But they do all that other stuff for you, including getting your ass to the gym. I think that athletes have a lot of that already built in. For Travis Scott, I'm always amazed that musicians can like keep a workout schedule and keep their diet on track when their schedules are so erratic. And then I think, the personal trainer or whomever else is really, really important. With athletes, I think, and Sean Pendergast made this point, a lot of the structure is already built in. You have your trainers, you have your schedule laid out for you. You're not traveling nearly as much, but I think having that person in your life that keeps you honest is important. I think engineering your environment and making it easy to do the right thing is one lesson I think I learned as an athlete, but it's been reinforced over time. The book Atomic Habits, I would highly recommend that. So I've recommended the hardcover pamphlet, The Coffee Bean. I highly, highly, highly recommend the book Atomic Habits if you're into like just trying to engineer your environment in your day so that all your little short-term goals are aligned with your long-term goals. It's awesome. I know there's like 18 really good books about habits. That's just the one that worked for me. Final piece of advice from Tom Brady.
Every day you're going to wake up and just try to keep attacking it, Like Michael says, keep learning. Be curious, be humble, and work hard.
Tom Brady, because he has to outdo everybody else, he lumped item number 5. He made actually 3 bits of advice out of it. So be curious, be humble, work hard. Sounds simple enough. I think, though, the be curious part has always intrigued me because you hear so many stories, I think, especially in basketball, for whatever reason. It seems like basketball and baseball, the greats stay curious all the time. Like they're always trying to figure out some way to change their game. And, Larry Bird, Kobe Bryant, like those guys, you'd hear these stories about just how they were constantly soaking things in, asking questions. Bill Belichick is a coach. Now he's a selfish lover. He gets information from people, but he never gives it out. Ideally, you're making this symbiotic. Remember when Tom Brady and Peyton Manning got together in the offseason the one year to just basically exchange notes? Like that's the kind of stuff that you see this in every industry. There's people that just stay curious their entire lives. I also think that's a key to longevity too. Like if you look at people who grow old and stay very vibrant as they're older, they're generally pretty curious about stuff. So in your profession or in athletics or just in life in general, stay curious, be humble. This comes up so much. We've heard this both from Will Anderson and C.J. Stroud. I don't know what book everybody's reading that's really nailing down the humility, because obviously, yes, humility is always a good thing, but it's a common theme now with a lot of what the athletes are regurgitating when they're giving interviews. And I just want to know where it comes from and like what book it is. If any of you guys know like what's out there right now that's really pounding remember like a few years ago, Know Your Why had resurfaced. And I think it was because Simon Sinek had repurposed some Aristotle or something. And that was the big one, Know Your Why. Now it's turned into a lot of humility. The one area where I think that could really be relevant is because of social media. Like maybe it's harder to stay humble now because you're constantly getting praise and love on social media, but you're also constantly getting hate on social media. I feel like some of these guys like get way more humility in the form of doses of hatred than anybody else ever has, whether they're athletes or not. I do think though too, like there's an old school humility. You remember the story, if you read the book Moneyball, there's a story in there about Jeff Bagwell, which is it's very flattering of Jeff Bagwell, and yet I know that Jeff Bagwell despises the movie Moneyball. I don't know if he despises the book. He called the movie a farce. There's a scene in the book Moneyball. Scott Hatteberg was the first baseman for the A's, and he tells a story about how in moving from catcher to first base, he actually really loved the ability and the chance to chat with guys when they got to first base. So the first time Bagwell ever got to first base and Scott Hatteberg was playing first base, he kept telling Bagwell how awesome he thought he was, and Bagwell kept saying like, "I hate my swing, man. I hate my swing." And Bagwell was that old school dude that like probably had some demons driving him from something bad along the way, but like just did not have that same, years and years and years of sports psychologists poking and prodding and making you say all the right things. And I think a lot of athletes were more like that back in the day. I think they were like Michael Jordan, Larry Bird. Like, I feel like those guys they were driven and they had a little bit of like they were very self-critical. And so staying humble maybe is that. Don't hate yourself like the old school guys did, but be a little bit self-critical. Advice number 3 that he gave right there was work hard. Because Schwarzenegger, in his book, which I listened to the audio version of it, and I got to tell you, the first chapter was read and narrated by Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I got about maybe 2/3 of the way through that chapter, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to finish this book listening to Arnold. They thankfully had a professional narrator come in and do the rest of the chapters until the very end. Arnold finishes up a short chapter at the end too. But one of the big themes and messages in that book, going back to when he was a kid, was like, there's just no excuse for doing the reps. Like always try to work efficiently, always try to, be smart about the way you go about the work. But at the end of the day, just doing more quality reps than everybody else is what it usually takes. You just got to work harder at it and do the reps. Always do the reps. Watch the film. So unfairly judging these guys based on still frames. And then also, I've got to have a word with Adam Schefter about the way all of this was reported, throwing, frankly, a little bit of undue shade potentially at all these guys, but especially C.J. Stroud is the only one we're worried about. So this right here, any of you who coach teenagers or speak to teenagers will recognize the look of when you think you're giving a really good speech and you look out at teenagers and you see nothing but blank faces. And except for maybe Anthony Richardson down there at the end. You got to power through that. That's one thing I've learned. The teenagers might love what you're saying, but it's very unlikely that they're going to lose their stoic demeanor unless you can make them laugh. But you got to go full Adam Sandler at times to make the teens laugh. Obviously, these guys are a little bit older, but they're also on camera, and they're also with what happens with athletes is, especially football players, they've been drilled into their head to just be respectful and everything and stay on one knee, and they don't want to. They're like recruits in the Marines. They don't want to smile or anything and get singled out. So, but I think it's pretty obvious there that C.J. Stroud is concentrating harder than anybody else. So other 3 should really be embarrassed by themselves. Okay. Will Levis, bad body language, got his hand over his mouth, probably looks skeptical. C.J. Stroud, deep in thought. Okay, I'm gonna talk about C.J. here. Bryce Young, acceptable. And Anthony Richardson, I'm going to say Anthony Richardson looks exactly like I've showed you how Nick Caserio looks when he's wrapped with attention or just giddy about talking about D'Amico Ryans. Where he's like, he gets just like a girl, sitting on the edge of her bed at a slumber party, telling the other girls about how awesome D'Amico is. That's how D'Amico gets. And that's how Anthony Richardson is. When I think this is when Travis Scott was talking. CJ there, I think this is what happens with CJ. I've thought about this a lot because I've seen so much of CJ where he's like incredibly thoughtful, like pensive. And I think at times it looks almost like brooding would be the word. Is that the right word? Where you're deep in thought, like with almost a scowl on your face. And I honestly wonder if some football coaches confuse that intense confusion or intense like concentration as skepticism. And I only speak from experience because I've got like this, like I think because I furrow my brow a lot deep in thought when I was a kid. I've got this line. I've always had this line down on my brow from the time I was like 16 years old. And I swear, I think sometimes people see me and they think I'm giving them like a sour look. And I wonder if that's where the disconnect is. God, I hope so. And I hope it was like some of these dumbass amateur wannabe psychologist football coaches that play asinine games at the combine that let something as stupid as that soil or affect their view of CJ Stroud. Because I think if anything, the kid just, if you look at his mechanics as a passer, if you look at his mechanics compared to Bryce Young or any of these other guys' mechanics, certainly Will Levis and Anthony Richardson, those guys are all over the place. But even Bryce Young, because Bryce Young does a lot of stuff really well. But CJ Stroud is pristine in that regard. I think you got to remember that like CJ's been going to the same Elite 11 camps. CJ's been coached by Gerard Johnson, his current quarterback's coach, before at the Elite 11 camps. Bryce and CJ had a lot of crossover with different things that they did. Will Levis, quarterback tutors out the wazoo, I'm sure. But Anthony Richardson a little bit more raw, I think. But like those guys have all had that instruction. But to get the mechanics and the delivery that CJ has, that's meticulous attention to detail. That is something that just doesn't happen naturally. You know, that's not like, oh, the magical pure golf swing that a few guys have where it just seems like it's sent down from heaven. That's something that you work at over time. And that's something that you get with like a maniacal obsession to detail. And that maniacal obsession to detail is what Gary Kubiak, Kyle Shanahan, those guys that have operated a Kubshana-Stanny offense very well, that tends to be what they have and what they value. So I like it. I'm getting more and more excited every time I watch CJ Stroud either scrutinize Travis Scott or take instruction at rookie minicamp. Okay, this is how it all went down. This is how it came to my attention. And this is where I got a bone to pick with Adam Schefter. And I'm going to give bouquets to Ian Rappaport for getting it right. Adam Schefter reported this little luncheon they had with Michael Rubin as on the first day of NFLPA rookie events in LA, the top 4 QBs drafted, Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, Will Levis, are instead attending a lunch at Fanatics CEO Michael Rubin's house with Tom Brady, Travis Scott, and Rubin to discuss entrepreneurship and brand building. So a couple things there. One, like as soon as I read this, you see instead, and it sounds like these 4 are just kind of kicking all the other rookies in the NFLPA to the curb so they can go do their own thing. That sounds they're like pretty selfishly motivated. But for that to be true, this lunch would have supplanted an entire day of activities by the NFLPA, which doesn't seem to make much sense at all. So I don't know if Schefter has just gotten sloppier and sloppier, or if he's just a bad writer, because it seems like half the mistakes he makes with some of these tweets these days are like just from poor writing. Like the 5 Ps, proper planning prevents piss poor performance. He ignores 3 of those Ps. And I think it's because he's in a hurry to get the tweet out. Whereas Ian Rappaport, who famously admitted that he wasn't getting any information from the Texans, as guys like Schefter were like kind of pulling their best. What's his name there? From ESPN, the basketball Windhorst, doing his best Windhorst to say, well, I think maybe the Texans could possibly not be taking a quarterback. Why else would they making a mockery of himself, just suggesting that the Texans weren't going to take a quarterback? Ian Rappaport flat out said, no, they're not giving me any information. So Ian Rappaport puts his own report out, which frankly looked like kind of subtweeting in Adam Schefter's direction. He says, great thing to do after the QBs handled their responsibilities with the NFLPA for the rookie premiere. They went to this lunch. So CJ Stroud, not shirking any of his responsibilities, clearly outperforming the other rookie quarterbacks at this event, and soaking up all the information and advice and utilizing it better than all the other three guys already.